Most crises are punctuated by short, simple events. Something happens, a crash, a little bit of organizational dirty laundry is revealed and leaked to the press. There's some tangible moment, and that is the period of crisis. The BP crisis is a little bit different because it was ongoing for 5 months. So this gives us a really good opportunity to look at how crisis response can develop in the midst of an ongoing crisis. The leadership of BP became one of the central storylines in this crisis, and the gaffes from Tony Hayward. Heck, there was even a South Park episode that poked fun at Tony Hayward's response. When we began this process of analysis, we expected, frankly, Tony Hayward and the other leaders of BP to have just done a terrible job in managing their roles as organizational leaders. But as the story unfolds, I think you'll find that it's a little bit more complex than that. So, why do this study? From an intellectual standpoint, leaders during crises are in precarious positions. Most of the time, this is the person who's going to be ousted the next day. We're going to find out that the leader has resigned and the organization is moving on without them. This is a pretty consistent type of a story. During major crises, leaders tend to be negatively evaluated. It's hard to really get very angst-ridden about organizations. It's much easier to direct our public ire at people, because it's ultimately the people that we hold accountable. Yet at the same time, with substantial organizational crises, there's this interaction with the media. So an agenda-setting approach is useful in trying to understand how it is that a leader can respond to a major crisis. The findings from previous research indicate pretty clearly that negative coverage influences public opinion. So you have the leader trying to manage it. They know they're on the chopping block. You have the agenda setting. And so what's absolutely critical is that leaders be engaged. They be engaged with the critical stakeholders, with regulators at all levels, in order to restore the faith in the organization. So this is our starting point. This is our set of assumptions. These 3 components. So as we move on to our study focus, the big question that we are asking is the leader the lion? Is this the person who is charging forth unafraid, unabashed, or frankly, are they going to be led to the slaughter? Is it inevitable that the leader is the person who's going to be held accountable, they're going to get fired, the whole 9 yards? But more importantly, what kind of a communicative function do corporate leaders serve during crises? So we know they're supposed to be emotional leaders. We look to them for reassurance, this kind of thing. But in a much more detailed level, what do leaders do? This is something that the literature is, frankly, quite fuzzy on. Secondly, what influence do factors like source, this is in terms of our agenda setting approach, source and situation have on a leader's message? So are we seeing the leader's verbiage being distorted based on source? And how responsive are they to different issues that emerge during the crisis? And during a crisis, there's always the material crisis, the problem that has to be solved. But there's other situations that are related, the knock-on effects, and we'll get into those a little bit more later. But what influence do those have on, frankly, what it is that the leader is saying? How responsive are they? So if we understand the anatomy of a tragedy, and for those of you who have done a little bit of literature or theater study, in a lot of ways, we can use a theater analogy to talk about the emergence of a tragedy, and particularly the tragedy in the Gulf. Order is what we always begin with. Everything's fine. We haven't heard about BP for a while, even though they have a bit of a track record for crises. Then the crisis hits. On April 21st, 2010, the explosion happens. What we know at that moment is that about a dozen workers had been killed. And then the rest of it begins to unfold. And then in the end, once we finally get to September, and the well is officially killed, we again have order. Everything is restored. The tragic leader, in this case Tony Hayward, has been killed. Bob Dudley, the new leader, has been selected, and things begin to calm down. So if we think about it in crises in terms of this moment of chaos, this moment of conflict, it's a useful metaphor for understanding what it is that organizations have to do. And frankly, when you can see an oil spill from space, you know it's going to be a problem. So this picture gives a little bit of a bird's eye view. A lot of us probably saw these pictures. But this is really what we're talking about. There's no way to hide from a crisis in the Gulf. You know, we see how much of the Gulf of Mexico was actually affected by the oil slick. This is what Tony Hayward and the other leaders at BP had to manage. So, tragedy in the Gulf. Oh, Tony Hayward. He was an amazing character to watch. You know, the gaffes that he offered us were lovely. The "I want my life back" one was probably the absolute best. Standing beside him is Carl Svanberg. Now this was, you know, he was also a bit of a gaff beast, talking about the small people. This was largely a translation problem. He's Swedish, and he was talking about ordinary people, but it came out so terribly. So if you're trying to manage a crisis, especially one of the magnitude of the crisis in the Gulf, and you're producing these kind of gaffes, "I want my life back," "we care about the small people," this isn't going to help your organization recover from the crisis particularly effectively. So we can ask the question, is the story so simple? Obviously, I don't think so. But what this offers us from a literature and from a research perspective is a deeper analysis of three concepts: issue management, crisis leadership, and agenda setting. So let's take a look at the literature on issue management. Why are we focusing on issue management? What issue management is a perspective that makes the argument that when an organization is responding to almost any situation, what they're trying really to do are manage the material and the reputational issues associated with it. So we don't speak in a vacuum, we're talking about something. So the issues management perspective focuses really on the persuasive nature of crisis response strategies. What this also means then is that we can separate the material reality of the spill happening and all the efforts that internally an organization might take to deal with whatever the crisis is, and the reputational aspects of the crisis. As communication scholars, we're interested in the reputational aspects. The material aspects always have to be dealt with, and that's an important component of what an organizational leader or any PR person in an organization is going to be talking about. But by separating the two, we can focus on what a communication scholar is about, and that is the words, the verbiage, the reputation management component. This also, the issue management perspective, I think helps to remove a disconnect between the message and the issue. And this is something that in other crisis perspectives, a lot of the times isn't present. A lot of the times we see analysis of simply the messages themselves without really understanding the context and the influence. One of the other papers that you're reading for the week, the image repair theory, is a really foundational and very strong way of explaining crisis communication, yet it does not address this notion of context. Contingency theory, on the other hand, I think does. Both are instructive in different ways, but for me, I think understanding how what we say is affected by what's going on just makes a lot of sense. Then when we shift gears and take a look at the leadership literature, what we find is really a bunch of divergent and not very clearly examined roles that leaders may take on. So the question is, what's the common thread that holds it all together? Well, the challenge of being a leader in a crisis is you kind of have to be all things to all people. There's a lot of research that points to the psychological role of the leader, that his or her goal is to reaffirm and inspire not only the members of the organization, but the members of the public. There is certainly a functional role to direct and manage the material needs, not so much in the purview of the communication scholar, but an important internal role that they're going to serve. And there's, of course, a public relations role. When we're talking about crises, we want to hear from the boss. We don't really want to hear all the time from the PR person, from folks lower in the organization. We want to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. This is a challenge. You know, a functional leader of an organization like BP, Tony Hayward, for example, he's a geologist. He ascended to his position because of his material strengths, not because he could serve the psychological role, and certainly not because he was a public relations expert. So this is part of the challenge, is that you have people often as CEOs, as major organizational leaders, who don't have sufficient public relations or social psychology training in order to respond effectively to them from the reputational standpoint. In the crisis, obviously this is necessary. So there are emergent tensions in the reality of crisis leadership. So given all of these roles, we may ask, do roles for leaders change throughout a crisis? And frankly, can a single leader be all things to all people? Is it reasonable to assume that one person can effectively take on all of these different roles? So given that BP had a number of functional leaders, local folks in the Southeast United States, they have the corporate leaders, they have this whole mix of people who are in positions of leadership, the question is, or what I think was an interesting approach to this, is to ask, do different leaders meet different needs during a crisis? Do they serve different purposes? And then finally, of course, we have the fly in the ointment for organizations. Obviously, if organizations could just get their message out, unfiltered, uncritiqued, their lives would be easier. But we have the media. And this is not to say that we should look at the media as bad, adversarial, or whatever the case may be. But their job is to reveal truths, at least we would hope so. So this is sometimes at odds with what an organization wants to share, the information they want to communicate. So during the BP crisis, for example, we learned that some graphic folks in BP's employ manipulated some of the images we were seeing of the flow from the bottom of the ocean. Now, what they did didn't really change our big picture understanding about it, but it certainly raised suspicions about what BP was doing. So how we understand as a public as the public stakeholders, how we understand the crisis is going to be partly filtered by what we see in the media. This is agenda setting theory. What this makes the big argument as is not that the media tells us what to think, but they certainly tell us what to think about. In this case, a mega transgression where the organization has done something so massively wrong, media saturation was absolutely unavoidable. You could not flip on a news report, turn on the news, see a news brief without some mention of BP. Not only in the United States, but in the UK as well. What we've also found in research on agenda setting is that negative coverage has much stronger agenda setting effects. People are thinking about the issues and about certain issues when the coverage is negative. They're much more likely to jump onto that. It's because I think, frankly, we are a species of the macabre. We're interested in seeing when things go wrong. Basically, why does traffic slow down when there's a wreck? Well, because we're all rubbernecking to see if we might catch the little glimpse of the broken bodies in cars. We're horrible about this, right? But this is what the research on agenda setting suggests, is that when the negative coverage exists, people's attention is much more keenly honed to what the media is talking about. And third, the research suggests that the news perspective on any particular issue will influence the public opinion. So, for example, if you happen to self-select into watching MSNBC, and you happen to be liberal, what they say is probably going to influence you, just like if you're conservative and tune into Fox, what they say is likely to influence you. In today's age, where we can really select what news we are watching, reading, hearing, the perspective is increasingly influencing not just what we think about, but also, frankly, how we think about it. So when we link this with leadership, one of the questions that we need to ask is, can a leader control messaging and the types of stories? Can they be an agenda-setting entity? There's some research that makes the argument that yes, indeed, if a leader is effective in what they're talking about and how they're presenting it to different media sources, they can in fact be an agenda setter. They're telling the news what to think about, in short. So leaders and organizations can certainly shape the media's coverage agenda. But coming back to this point about media saturation, the spill was in the top 3 stories in the mainstream press for 14 weeks, and it was the top story during 9 weeks. There was no way to escape the BP crisis in the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. So this just magnifies the potential effects for agenda setting. So that's why when we combine issues management, crisis leadership, and agenda setting, we start to get that this is a pretty complex process. That it's not just how the leader communicates that they send out the right message. They should be doing that. But there's all these other factors wrapped up in it. So this led us to some basic questions, and don't worry too much about those. You'll see them as I talk about the results. But these are, by the way, for those of you who are interested in research, this is a way to set up your research questions and hypotheses. So, what did we do to collect? Well, for this particular one, we looked at every statement that BP's leaders uttered, from April 20th, 2010 to September 20th, 2010, based in these sources. Their own press releases, Fox News, the Houston Chronicle, Christian Science Monitor, the BBC, and The Sun. So what we are trying to do is get a balance of US and UK sources. We're trying to get a balance of conservative and liberal, and also local. That's the Houston Chronicle. So these are the actual numbers of stories that had direct quotations from any of the leaders from BP. So the other part of this was then to start taking a look at how the tactics that an organizational leader might use, the left column, matches up with the issues that were covered on the right. These issues emerged from looking at the headlines or the subheaders for each of the stories or press releases. And what emerged when the leaders had made statements were these issues, that leaders were talking about status updates, BP's response to criticism, the spill impacts on people, BP's leadership, compensation, and so on and so forth. These were the topics that any of the leaders were talking about. The tactics that they used, the content of their messages, is what we see on the left. So are they trying to bolster the image of the organization, say BP cares, self-enhancement? Is this a routine update? Are they simply reporting, today we dropped the giant hairball in the hopes that it would plug the hole, all the silly names that they had for stuff? Are they trying to frame the crisis? Framing the crisis is trying to explain what's happening in a way that is ideally most favorable to you, but still true. That's an important part of it. Framing the organization, trying to portray the organization in a particular way. Antisocial ones are very fun because these are the defensive responses. These include a range of tactics from simply denying responsibility to saying it's someone else's fault to minimizing the issues, any host of things that are really defensive in nature. Accommodative emphasizes we're going to make it better. Excellence and renewal is really a future-oriented tactic. We're moving on. And interorganizational relationships are also an interesting tactic because these can be both positive and negative. You may be trying to identify a positive relationship with another organization, trying to help bolster your own credibility by saying, we're working with them. With BP's case, they talked a lot about their partnership with the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard in this case had the positive image they're trying to latch on. You're also trying, with interorganizational relationships, to separate yourselves from negatively viewed others. So you saw a lot of messaging that had to do with Transocean and Halliburton. So you're trying to say, the guys who laid the concrete, Halliburton, weren't really very good guys after all. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The first point that I was interested in, that we really focused our analysis on, was how did the different leaders communicate? Were there differences between the major corporate leaders, Tony Hayward, Bob Dudley, and Carl Svanberg, and the functional leaders, the folks on the ground, managing operations, what have you? So what we see with this list is a lot of consistency. They're all obviously talking about the organization. This is an image-oriented approach. You'd expect that. They're managing the crisis. They're being good representatives of their organization. Yet, as we start to get into the nuts and bolts, we start to see some major differences when we take the corporate leaders, Hayward, Dudley, and Svanberg, and compare them to the functional leaders. We see a big divergence. Functional leaders aren't being defensive. They're not trying to offer blame anywhere. They're not trying to minimize the role. They're focused on really the day-to-day. It's the corporate leaders who took on some different roles, focused on the bigger picture, the saving basically the stock price, or trying to make the global image of BP better. And this makes a lot of sense. The functional leaders are trying to deal with the material problems. The corporate leaders are being really the face pieces. So when we take a look then at the influence of source, tone, and issue, and we isolate for our 4 categories of leaders, the 3 corporate and then the functional, what I found was that Tony Hayward was BP's most responsive leader. So what this means is that the source of the message, the tone of the message, and certainly the issue had the greatest effect on the content of what Hayward was talking about. So when the source, for example, was the press releases, obviously he's going to have the greatest opportunity to just share what he wants to share. And this is going to be the image-oriented focus. He's trying to focus on how good BP is in terms of responding to this crisis. He also was more able to affect the bad PR issues, leadership, and other issues as well. However, when we take a look at the corrective and defensive, we see a different factors that are influencing what it is, the message that Tony Hayward talked about. A way to take a look at these statistics is to see the source and issue as the factors explaining when Tony Hayward used a particular message. So when did he use the image-oriented strategy? Well, 25% of the time, that's the adjusted R-squared, what Tony Hayward said was predicted by press releases and the 3 issues of bad PR, leadership, and other issues. That's when he used the image-oriented. 17% of the time, Tony Hayward used a corrective message when the source was the Christian Science Monitor, the tone was positive, and the issues had to deal with status updates, the cost of the crisis, and BP's leadership. And these are all positive relationships on tone and issue, but negative on Christian Science Monitor. That means he is less likely to be heard using corrective language. BP cares, we're going to take care of the crisis, we will be in the Gulf for as long as it takes. You're less likely to hear that in Christian Science Monitor. So there's a bit of a media bias, an agenda-setting bias evident there. But when the tone is more positive and those issues are more positively used, that means they're being used more often, we are more likely to see Tony Hayward talking about the corrective nature. But we also see him 24% of the time using a defensive response. So when the tone is more positive in the story that you're reading, he's more likely to use a defensive response. He's also more likely to use a defensive response, obviously, when he's responding to criticism of BP. And that just makes sense. When confronted with people saying, "You suck," the response is typically to defend yourself. So if you start to understand the statistics and what they're telling us, they start to give us a nice picture of Tony Hayward being responsive to different issues. Certainly the introduction of some source bias, we'd expect that from press releases. But the Christian Science Monitor being a little bit biased in terms of less likely to allow the quotes to include quotations, where Tony Hayward was using corrective, focusing on what BP was doing to solve the problems for the fishermen, for the wildlife, what have you. That wasn't there in the Christian Science Monitor's coverage. So, how about Bob Dudley? He was the least responsive, and he also had the simplest messaging. Now, in part, he didn't come into this story until late June, early July, as things really heated up for Tony Hayward. But he was pretty straightforward. 35% of the time, he used an image-oriented strategy when he's talking about bad public relations issues and leadership. So we can account for his messaging, 35% of the time on those issues. We can predict that if he's talking about leadership, he's probably talking about the image-oriented. 19% of the time, when he's talking in the press releases, he's defending his company. What this meant is that there weren't a lot of predictors as to what Bob Dudley's talking points would be. He didn't vary how he talked based on the situation. That's how to understand when we see leanest responsive in messaging. He just said what he was going to say like he was reading from a script, and it just didn't matter what was going on around him. He had the same company line. Carl Svanberg, on the other hand, had the most complex messaging, but he still had a talking point focus, meaning that he still was not particularly responsive to what was going on around him. So you set up Tony Hayward as being responsive to what the issues were, being responsive to what was being talked about. The other leaders are really pretty much on talking points. Question is that good or bad? That's part of the discussion. That's part of the end game judgment. And then we come down to the functional leaders. These are the folks on the ground, and so of course they are incredibly responsive. What they say, when they say it, is going to depend very heavily not only on the sources because of the agenda setting function, to the degree to which the media sources want to hear from them, from the functional leaders. It's going to depend on what the message is, what the critique is that the media is interested in. They're also responsive based on the issues themselves. But with the functional leaders, we see the greatest amount of source agenda setting function being implemented. So if we're starting to get the picture here that leaders respond very differently, that's the central take-home, is who the leader is in a crisis is certainly going to affect what their responsive role is. So, how can we get this, put all of this information into a nice, tidy package? Well, I think one important talking point is that defensiveness is sometimes necessary. Across the crisis management literature, there is a huge movement to say you should never be defensive. Organizations who are defensive or use antisocial strategies are not going to be successful. But the heart and soul of a crisis typically involves some kind of critique of the organization. At some level, the organization has to respond to it. So defensiveness makes sense in certain issues and with certain situations. That's why the issues management perspective informs us much more effectively. So when we saw, for example, Tony Hayward being defensive, was certainly in response to criticisms. It's not as if he was being defensive across the board. We also didn't see the other leaders being really engaging in that much defensiveness. But that's because it should be used sparingly. Focusing on positive or messaging that moves beyond the crisis is of course going to make the most sense, but sometimes you just have to defend yourself. So how can we sum up the BP's leaders? Well, they used image-oriented restorative rhetoric. One of the other pieces that you're reading this week from Hurricane Katrina and Bush's response to that crisis focuses on this notion of image-oriented restorative rhetoric. Functionally, you're trying to say as an organization, we're moving on. We are trying to repair the situation. We're trying to do the best we can, but we're also a pretty good organization. We are doing our level best. So it's both about pushing attention on the actions you're doing to correct the problem, as well as trying to bolster your organization to say, hey, we're not so bad. What's a critical component of this is corporate identity. It's a central aspect of a leader's responsibility. So, said another way, organizational leaders must communicate a strong and positive sense of corporate identity when they're responding to a crisis. But this also points to very different roles for different leaders. So we start with what's common in the middle. All leaders share a restorative function of assessing the crisis and managing the issues of blame. They all need to show identity-based responses in their own media, certainly so on their web pages and press releases, tweets, what have you. But so we also see that this identity-based response is a key component of leadership and public relations. So what we found was that all leaders served these two purposes. Now, corporate leaders are really a little bit of a different beast. In this case, the three men were the lion protecting his pride. They are the defenders of the organization overall, but they also emphasize recovery. So it's not just that they're steaming in to bowl over anyone who critiques them. It's a little bit more of a delicate operation than that. So that's the functional corporate leader responsibility, is to protect and show recovery. The functional leaders, though, we can think of using a metaphor of the battlefield generals. They're the ones who are there day in and day out slogging it out. So they're going to be handling most of the day-to-day messaging. So status updates, things like that. They're also going to have to stay positive. It's not their job to defend the organization. It's their job to manage the material crisis. They're also likely to be the ones that offer initial reactions. What's happening, the person on the ground is going to be the one who talks about that. So if we think about it, the corporate leader is the motivational, the psychological leader. They're serving that particular set of functions. All leaders are focused on image and restoring the organization. But then you have the battlefield generals, the leaders who are managing the material component of the crisis, and they're going to have different roles and different communication messaging that we should expect to hear from them. Hopefully this is a way to sort of break down and separate the roles of leaders and to really answer the question, no, a single person in a major crisis cannot be all things to all people. But when we take a look more specifically at the corporate leaders, we see still more divergence in the roles that a leader may take on. So Bob Dudley, for example, was the company man. His focus was to talk about BP, focus on their image, be all positive, all pro BP, and not to have a lot of variance. The guy was reading from a script, functionally. He is the company man. This is an important leadership role because you need someone to be functionally the cheerleader in a crisis for the organization. But you also need someone who is really going to put themselves out there. In this case, the corporate CEO, Karl-Heinrich Svanberg, is what I called the definitive voice. He is the leader of the pride. He's going to have the most complex messaging. He's not going to necessarily respond to a lot of the issues. So he's still reading from a script, but his purpose is to defend the company. The corporate CEO, their main function is to protect the shareholder, right? In a publicly traded multinational corporation, that's who they are primarily responsive to. And so that's why they have to be seen taking on strong communicative responses. They're not too worried about being in the weeds and the details and the day-to-day. That's their role as the big picture. They're the definitive voice. And then you come to the workhorse. This is going to be the leader who is the public face. This is the person who's going to be doing the dirty work of taking public ire. But this is also the person, at some point, you have to have someone who is responsive to issues on the corporate leadership side. You know, the big bosses, someone has to do it. But this also means that his messages are not going to be incredibly complex. He's going to have a few talking points for each issue. He's going to have to respond differently, but at the same time, he's going to have to keep all the messages pretty simple so that the stories never get convoluted, so that he's not contradicting himself as he's having to take on various roles. So this leads me to the question then, what is the purpose of agenda setting and leadership? You know, with agenda setting, are we setting up at least one corporate leader to be the sacrificial lamb? So with Tony Hayward, his messaging was the only leader who was influenced by tone. And by this I mean the tone of the story. So when the tone was more positive, the messages that he was able to communicate were defensive and focused on corrective actions. So if a reporter was telling a story that was not a slam story, if you will, Tony Hayward got all of his messages out. However, there was a negative or neutral tone the overwhelming majority of the time. So what this really means is that he was not able to execute his strategy successfully. He was not able to be heard in the majority of media outlets to be talking about how BP can defend itself, what actions they were taking to correct the problem. Two very important pieces of information if you're trying to move beyond the crisis. So with Tony Hayward, we see the strongest agenda setting effect. Basically, the media never let him have his full say. That is what I think is interesting about this, is it's not that Tony Hayward wasn't trying to say all the right things from a PR perspective. He was. But his message just simply was not getting heard, because as the tone of the story changed, so too did the nature of the quotations that the authors of the stories were willing to include. To me, this suggests that the journalism wasn't particularly balanced. There can be negative tone while still fairly representing the views and the statements from a controversial source. You just add in more content that shows that really what they're talking about is a load of dribble. In this case, they were just excluding any messages that might make Hayward look good. They didn't have the agenda setting function didn't build up a careful, thoughtful response to it. They just omitted it. This meant that Hayward was not effective as a leader, an agenda-setting leader. So if the press releases are where we saw all of the range of responses that all the leaders, and certainly Tony Hayward, had. So the question is, if the press release is put out there in the world and nobody picks up on the messages, does it really matter? All three corporate leaders had key messages and strategies that remained in BP-owned media that were simply never picked up by mainstream media. This suggests that the media is definitely selective both about the BP storylines as well as the content of what they were willing to talk about that they included in their coverage. For example, in most of the mainstream media, we saw very little conversation about the environment. We saw lots of oil lapping on shore and environmental devastation, but never anything about what was being done to address the environmental problems. So the media storyline that we are seeing was not just a challenge for the BP leaders, that the BP leaders weren't able to just have their say and have their way with the media. But we also didn't see as much information coming out both for and against BP as we could have. That's why in complex crises, we cannot ignore the agenda-setting function. So, the bottom line is that leadership is a complex story. We can expect to hear and see at least one organizational leader, in the case of major crises, being fired, their role being diminished, whatever the case may be. But I think the better story that comes out of this research, and the better lessons we can learn, is that multiple leaders in an organization and during a crisis are likely to take on multiple roles. And secondly, that there needs to be a separation of the material and the reputational responses to crises. When you have to deal with the material crisis, the leak in the Gulf, that has to be dealt with. And that's a whole set of communication and public discourse that's separate from who we are as an organization. So, as you have questions or thoughts, please, I'm going to open up one of the forums in the discussion that's going to be reactions to the BP crisis. Ask any questions that you might have, offer any thoughts that you might have, and we will go from there.